First, I'd like to start off by acknowledgement of First Peoples. We have participants from many parts of the world at this webinar today, so I'd like to begin by acknowledging all First Peoples here today and paying my respects to them and to their forebears. We honour your wisdom, your stewardship of traditional lands and seas, and your customs that enrich us all. Welcome to you all. My name is Simon Corden. I'm the Chair of the National Regulators Community of Practice and also Commissioner at the Essential Services Commission in Victoria. I'm delighted to welcome you to our final webinar of 2020, and what a year it's been. And this marks our 17th webinar that we've delivered since April. Before I introduce our panel, just some quick housekeeping. For your colleagues who may have missed today, all of the National Regulated Community of Practice webinars are recorded and available on the ANZSOG YouTube channel within 14 days. It's my privilege today to introduce three stellar panellists, each of whom has the kind of CV that we drastically need to abridge or we'll never actually get to the discussion. Our first panellist is Luke Cornelius, Assistant Commissioner Luke Cornelius, who currently heads up Victoria Police's Northwest region, the latest role in a distinguished policing career. Coming to VicPol after 14 years with the Australian Federal Police, his previous roles include leading the Professional Standards Command, the Southern Metro region, as well as Victoria Police's response to the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission review into sex discrimination and sexual harassment. Luke has received numerous awards, including the Australian Police Medal and the National Police Service Medal and a UN Medal for service in East Timor. Our second panellist today will be Sandro Demanio. Dr. Sandro Demanio is a medical doctor and globally renowned public health expert and advocate. He previously worked for the World Health Organization and was CEO at the EAT Foundation. He co-founded the NCD-free global social movement and established a not-for-profit foundation to improve health and nutrition for Australian kids. Sandro has published many scientific journal articles and is the author of the Doctor's Diets Cookbook, while somehow finding time to co-host an ABC television and Netflix show, Ask the Doctor. And finally, but last but not least, is Julia Inman Grant. Now, Julia is Australia's first e-safety commissioner, one of the world's first government agencies committed to keeping citizens safer online. Julia has extensive experience in the not-for-profit and government sectors and spent 2 decades working in senior public policy and safety roles for firms such as Microsoft, Twitter and Adobe. As Commissioner, Julia plays an important global role as Chair of the Child Dignity Alliance's Technical Working Group and as a board member of We Protect Global Alliance. So 3 outstanding speakers today.
Yeah, good morning, Simon, and good morning to all the participants. Can I too begin by acknowledging that we meet on the land of the traditional owners, and from where I sit, the peoples of the Kulin Nations, and in particular the Wurundjeri, and acknowledge their custodianship and care for the land and waters over many generations, and also pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. So Simon, thank you very much for your kind words of introduction. Look, some people seek fame and notoriety, others eschew it. I guess I sort of fall in the latter category. I think the single biggest performance indicator I have in that space is my 2 kids. And so when I come home from a day's work and I cop the, "Oh, Dad, you've done it again," I'm forever finding myself saying sorry to my kids. But look, today I do want to have a chat to you about policing within the context of unreason and what that's looked like for Victoria Police within the context of policing and supporting the community in stopping the spread of a deadly virus, the global pandemic, which we all know as COVID. So I'll begin first with some context setting. And I think I should start with the role of Victoria Police. So Victoria Police's role is very much to serve the Victorian community, uphold the law so as to promote a safe, secure and orderly society. And our functions first and foremost are to preserve the peace, protect life and property, prevent offences, detect and apprehend offenders and help people in need of assistance. So it's very much with this mission and these functions in mind that we approach our policing task on a day-to-day basis, irrespective of the broader context that inform our approach. So today I'm going to touch specifically with you on our approach to policing protest and also policing compliance with the Chief Health Officer directions that have been in place over the course of the various lockdowns here in Victoria, directed first and foremost to achieving that public health object, which is to stop the spread of the global pandemic. So for us, ordinarily, when it comes to policing protest and regulating public order, we're pretty set in our ways. There are some well-established rules of racing, if you like. We will engage with protest organisers. We'll look to negotiate with them what their plans are. And we will then, if you like, adopt a policing stance and posture, which is very much about supporting the right to lawful protest within the context of a liberal democracy, and also to keep everyone safe, but also ensure that where people are exercising their right to protest, they do so in a way which doesn't harm or infringe the rights and interests of others. And so we seek to take very much a balanced approach. We also seek to be, if you like, blind to the particular issues that protesters might be protesting about. Not our job to pick sides or pick winners. And our focus absolutely is on the public safety piece. That's what we ordinarily see. Within the context of the global pandemic, and particularly the operation of the Chief Health Officer directions, which have imposed very significant restrictions on rights which everyone ordinarily takes for granted, our approach to policing has had to radically shift in order to support those directives. And if anyone had suggested to me 9 months ago that we would be policing in an environment where it was in fact unlawful to leave home to engage in protest, I wouldn't have believed you. In fact, I find myself now 9 months down the track regularly reflecting on just how radically different our approach to policing and how radically our approach towards policing in what for us have long been established approaches to policing, how radically that shifted. And that was no more marked than within the context of policing protest. So we found ourselves over the course of August into September and October with a very real risk associated with mass gatherings. We found ourselves in May in a situation where we had 114 active cases and 83 weekly infections. In August, that lifted to 6,613 active cases with weekly infections of 3,516. And it's within that context that we found ourselves having to adopt a very different approach to policing, which was about preventing protest. It was about preventing people from leaving home, and it was about having an approach to communications which was going to cut through those long established views about protest and the role of policing within that context. Now, our concern was, of course, that if we didn't have a message which cut through and we saw the usual approach to protest continue to operate within the context of these extraordinary weekly infection rates, we faced a very real risk on a week in, week out basis of significant mass spreading events, which would have just seen the levels of infection, exposure to risk and death absolutely go through the roof. So for us, from a policing context, our approach shifted from, rather than taking protest as we found it on the day, to having to adopt an approach which was very much about prevention. So every protest at the height of the stage 4 restrictions, which did prohibit people from leaving home to protest, We were reaching out to upwards of 350 people in advance of those protests, personally visiting them and urging them not to protest. We were taking preemptive action and in fact charging people with incitement, again to prevent the risk of mass gatherings. And then on the day of protests, rather than waiting for people to turn up, we adopted a strategy and tactics which was about early interdiction and early engagement to again give people an opportunity to go home and comply with the law. Now, all of this was happening within the context of a vigorous debate about the policing role. And so it was essential for us in the comms space to be very clear in our messaging about our expectations and about the approach that we would be adopting. But first and foremost for us, our focus remained again on balancing people's rights. And the primary right we were seeking to protect in the face of what was patently unreasonable behaviour, given the context, was the right to life. And the primacy that we attached to protecting the right of life informed our intent and our approach. So we've learned a great deal over the course of the last 9 months, and I think I would distill those key lessons into a couple of key points. The first is this: the need for comms and engagement is critical. It needs to be proactive, and we need to be very clear about the intent that we're trying to achieve. We also need to be prepared to adapt and shift in our comms necessarily, and our force posture and our policing tactics also had to shift as protest behaviour shifted and also as the rules changed. And we all know that the show directions change quite regularly, and that of itself gives rise to significant confusion. So the need for ongoing communications and engagement was critical, and using social media to get our narrative out to help explain our approach was also a key part of that approach. And then the other key piece or lesson for us from a policing context was to focus on maximising our agility and our interoperability in an operational sense. But the other piece for us was also to vigorously advocate for preventative measures and community engagement measures, rather than seeing enforcement as the default approach to securing compliance. We were blessed in Victoria with very significant levels of voluntary compliance into the mid-90s, 95% of the population voluntarily complying with those directions. We were dealing with a very small percentage of the community. We needed to be very upfront and clear about why we were adopting that approach. But the key piece for us always, in terms of getting the balance right, was to continue to provide strong advice back to the health authorities and other agencies about the need to get the balance right between enforcement and prevention. And for us, measures which promote voluntary compliance, which maximise the prevention piece, are always going to be favoured by us, because the alternative is police default into the role of the bad parent, and others who ought to be taking leadership in this space too easily are able to assume responsibility for it. Our approach to policing within the context of a global pandemic has been very much about looking for engagement with all agencies of state, with a focus on achieving the ultimate public good, which is a healthy, safe and secure society. And that's been the approach I take. I look forward to hearing from the other speakers, and I look forward to your questions. Back to you, Simon.
Okay, Julie, fantastic. So looking forward to hearing from Julie Inman Grant to talk about the work of the E-Safety Commissioner. I'm guessing the idealistic early proponents of the World Wide Web never envisaged how, alongside with its extraordinary benefits, would come a multitude of hatred and disinformation, cyberbullying and outright untruths. So we're all very keen to hear about your work, Julie, in addressing that critical challenge.
Oh, thanks. Well, I look forward to talking to about the history as well. But first, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on which we all meet. I'm coming to you from the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I would like to pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Next slide, please. Thank you. It's great to be here and to be able to contribute to this really important and timely discussion around regulating unreason online. I guess when most of us think of unreason on the internet, our minds probably jump first to the social dilemma, and maybe then to the spread of misinformation and conspiracy theories, political polarization, radicalization, and even Donald Trump. But unreason can also take on other insidious forms, like online bullying of children, targeted online abuse, the spread of racism and hate speech, and of course, the grooming, sexual exploitation, and abuse of children. So it is really interesting to look at how the political discourse around internet regulation has shifted in recent years. In the beginning, regulation was conveniently portrayed by the tech industry as an impediment to innovation. Tech companies were moving fast and breaking things and wanted only one thing from government: to stay out of our way. As someone who was at tech policy ground zero, it's safe to say that for the past 25 years, governments around the world have been more than happy to oblige so as not to undermine economic growth or curtail free speech. But now I think it's pretty clear that we've reached a tipping point, and governments are starting to wake up to the fact that what's now playing out online is not just a threat to individual citizens, but also potentially looms as an existential threat to democracy and civilized society. All this is important because laws are local, but the internet is global. Next slide, please. As a young DC lobbyist working for Microsoft back in 1996, when the internet was on the cusp, I had a formative role in shaping Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, one of the key pieces of legislation that has allowed the social media giants to become the behemoths they are today. In fact, that photo was of me with Bill Clinton at the first White House Summit on Online Safety in 1996. And at the time, the internet truly was in its infancy, and Section 230 was created to shield the companies from third-party activity happening on their platforms, otherwise known as intermediary liability. So you've got to remember, at that time, it was Microsoft, AOL, Novell, Netscape that were all big at the time. I mean, social media wasn't even a consideration. Mark Zuckerberg was likely just hitting puberty, maybe more worried about pimples than contemplating building the world's biggest social media empire. But one of the problems with 230 is it doesn't just apply to the tech giants. It also shields fringe and illegal websites and channels, allowing them to spread hate, conspiracy theories, and share in the trade of child sexual abuse images and pro-terrorist content. So decades on, it's clear to most that Section 230 is in need of a thoughtful and comprehensive rethink, and not one colored by concerns of political echo chambers. Next slide, please. It's easy to look at today's internet as too wild to tame, and it can be difficult to know where to start. Thankfully, the Australian government was an early and decisive mover here. In 2015, eSafety was created, making us the first government online safety regulator in the world whose sole purpose was the protection of its citizens online. Being first is not just lonely, but without any precedent whatsoever, we've had to sort of write the online safety playbook as we've gone along. And in 5 short years, we've seen a rapid expansion. We started life as the Children's eSafety Commissioner, just dealing with cyberbullying and illegal content. Since then, our remit has expanded to include all citizens, as well as image-based abuse, an informal scheme around adult cyber abuse, powers to tackle abhorrent violent material granted in the wake of the devastating Christchurch shootings, as well as related ISP blocking powers. And our powers are set to expand even further with the government drafting new updates to the Online Safety Act, and these should be out imminently. Next slide, please. At eSafety, we actually deal with very little content that is hosted in Australia. In fact, we're almost exclusively dealing with online illegal and harmful content that is hosted overseas. While this shows that our efforts are having a real impact on our own shores, when it comes to more permissive online hosting environments overseas, Our actions are much more limited by sovereignty and jurisdiction. But things are changing. Just last week, Ireland announced the establishment of its own online safety commissioner, and Fiji established theirs last year. In the coming months, we also expect Canada and the UK to set up their own national online safety regulators. And in the US, the incoming Biden-Harris administration has announced it's forming a task force to look at the intersection between online harassment and violence against women. So I suspect that in the next 5 to 10 years, we'll see an international network of online safety regulators working together to make the internet a safer and more civil place. And I believe we'll need those pincher moves to make sure that this is successful and it has the force to counterbalance the weight of the tech behemoths. Next slide, please. But even in the 5 years we've been in existence, the threat landscape has changed immeasurably. The incidents of online harms have been supercharged as COVID-19 has tightened its grip on the world, and more of us have turned to the internet to continue to work, learn, be entertained, and connect. I would even argue that the internet has become an essential utility over this period of time. And so there's really no question that the convergence of the whole world coming online, coupled with fear, uncertainty, and doubt, has created the perfect storm, churning up the toxic cesspool that the internet has sadly become. To demonstrate, from March to September this year, when compared to the same period last year, we've seen an almost doubling in adult cyber abuse, a 32% increase in youth-based cyberbullying, a 123% increase in child sexual abuse material, and a more than 172% increase in image-based abuse, or other words, the non-consensual sharing of intimate images and videos. Next slide, please. We all know that technology doesn't stay still for long, and policy does struggle to keep pace. And with new technologies, we're also starting to see new threats emerge online where the internet is increasingly being weaponized. One concerning trend we're seeing in youth-based cyberbullying is the increased use of multiple imposter accounts for the purposes of targeting a specific child. We refer to this as phoenixing. So as one account is suspended for violations on social media, then the next one will be resurrected in its place to continue taunting that same child. We're also starting to see serious cyber abuse that involves volumetric trolling. So coordinated cross-platform abuse that is often directed at high-profile women. We saw this with Maggie Sabansky and with Naya Del Nuone in the second half of 2020. Now, in some instances, this form of high-volume cyber abuse has been driven by organized conspiracy theorists, anti-vaxxers, and political agitators. The aim of these attacks, of course, is to overwhelm the target with an avalanche of negativity and hate, and to ultimately silence the target. The Australian government is looking at what tools we might have at our disposal to address some of these issues that happen at scale, because trying to take each of these down tweet by tweet or post by post is really like trying to swat at individual bees in the midst of a swarm. With image-based abuse, we've been able to think ahead, and our scheme now includes deepfakes and other manipulated media. These deepfakes are powered by sophisticated AI producing fake but extremely realistic images, audios, and videos of people saying and doing things they didn't actually say or do. As this artificial intelligence becomes more readily available, it's becoming an arms race, as this technology will increasingly be used to create fake news, false pornographic media, and malicious hoaxes, further proliferating abuse and eroding trust in governments and democratic institutions. Next slide, please. While we have these unique powers to protect Australians online, a large part of our focus at eSafety is on prevention, making sure that these harms don't happen in the first place. But our work instilling the critical reasoning skills needed for people to protect themselves online is only going to become more difficult as this unreason metastasizes online. It's already getting harder to shift the radical beliefs that are becoming so deeply entrenched on social media as social media algorithms create filter bubbles of misinformation. Last week, you may have seen the New Zealand Royal Commission into the Christchurch attacks revealed that the shooter had been radicalized on YouTube, where he was fed video after video of inspiration and indoctrination. To break the cycle, we not only need more transparency in algorithms, we also have to start educating children earlier because we know that many kids today are online as early as the age of 2, or at least 42%. By the time they're 4 years old, 81% are given an interconnected device. So if we wait until they're teenagers before talking to them about online safety, it's too late. Next slide, please. With primary schools, we recommend the teaching of the 4 R's of the digital age: respect, responsibility, resilience, and critical reasoning skills. This is the time when we really need to establish the guidelines and the rules in terms of balancing screen time, using devices in open areas of the home, and getting kids to question everything they see, hear, and read online. It's becoming such a serious issue that I think it needs to become more like a basic hygiene factor for kids, like putting on sunscreen and brushing teeth. And we as parents also need to role model good online behavior too. Next slide, please. So why does information take hold so easily? It turns out it's down to our ancient human wiring. A recent American study looked into the reasons why misinformation about COVID-19 and recent US election was able to spread like wildfire. It showed that when it comes to misinformation online, most people think others are more susceptible to fake news than they are. The research referred to this as the third person effect, the idea that I don't need help, but that guy does. And it means it's harder to get people to take part in media literacy and critical reasoning education programs. The other interesting finding was that content containing misinformation was more likely to evoke negative emotions such as fear, worry, and disgust. As we are emotional animals, we tend to act on this indignation by sharing and making this content go viral. Why do you think the social media platforms don't mind feeding a bit of controversy? Because conflict creates stickiness on their platforms. In short, it's good for online business, unlike neutral or scientific information. Next slide, please. So how do we change the future? Well, I'm not sure that there's a silver bullet. A key part of the solution must involve putting the responsibility back on the platforms who, through the action of opaque algorithms, have allowed us to get to this point where emotion trumps fact and abuse is allowed to exist almost unchallenged. The tech firms know how their platforms have been weaponized, and they know full well what the harms are. They've got abundant resources, the best minds in the world, and they're creating the most advanced technologies. Shouldn't they be able to apply these in ways that can anticipate a whole range of risks and harms and prevent them? To me, unreason is summed up by the inaction of these companies to prioritize the safety of their users. This is why we have been so actively pushing safety by design. Car manufacturers today actually compete on safety features, and consumers buy cars based on what's going to be safest for their family, because safety is mandated and it's built in by design. But in the tech industry, even when things have gotten so bad online, and they will not act without a direct threat to revenue or reputation or the specter of regulation. This needs to change and become their license to operate. Final slide, please. Industry do sense the winds of change are starting to blow and are already circling the wagons. While Facebook's CEO is claiming on one hand that they welcome regulation, their lobbying strategy would suggest otherwise. Twitter and some others are currently lobbying the European Union and promoting the hashtag Open Internet, which calls on governments not to constrain free speech by making them take down harmful content, only illegal content like child sexual abuse material. But think about that. They don't want to have to take down harmful content. We've been down this road before, and where we allow industry to dictate the final destination, and we know where it leads. All care for profit, but no responsibility. It's time for all of us to choose a path in a new direction and create a safer, more civil internet for everyone. Thank you. Last slide.
Fantastic. Look, thank you very much, Julie. There's a lot of material in there that I'm sure will spark quite a bit of discussion when we get to the open section, the question and answer section. I believe Sandro has now been able to join join us. Had a few IT issues, which is fantastic. So welcome, Sandro. I provided a bit of introduction before, but as I said, Sandro works in medicine, very long and honourable history in confronting mass hysteria driven by fear and quack cures. So keen to hear your thinking on the challenge of dealing with unreason. Over to you, Sandro.
Well, thanks very much for having me. I have spent the last half an hour trying to log in, and just a big thank you to the IT system who were incredibly patient. Also, my EA at this end who was incredibly patient. Proof that even after 9 months of doing Zoom meetings, we can still find something not to work. Even the restart the computer trick didn't work, so it ended up being change the computer trick. I'd just like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land that I'm on here in Carlton today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation and their elders past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to acknowledge any First Nations leaders listening in to this important webinar. I'd also like to acknowledge and thank the organisers and of course my two previous speakers. I don't think I was planned to go last, but as it turns out, I think it's a really great order, because what I'm going to speak about really picks up where Julie and Luke left off. It's really about, acknowledging that there are some big issues as we live in a world of the infodemic, the huge amount, the deluge of misinformation, and what role does government have, but actually how do we bring about some of those important regulatory levers that are going to really be the only solution in conjunction with other aspects more focused on the individual to rein in this era of misinformation that we now live in. I started my life as a medical doctor, and I like to kind of go back to the concept of informed consent, because if you go and have a procedure on your leg, something chopped off, or you go and have eye surgery, it becomes a pretty important concept, that nothing can be done to you without informed consent. And that's not just, hey, Mr. Smith, are you okay to have eye surgery? It needs to actually meet some fairly considered and legally binding criteria. So the first is that there needs to be full and open disclosure. You actually need to share the information, good and bad, of what you are proposing, so that the individual can make an informed choice based on fact and not based on opinion. The second is that the individual needs to be free from coercion. So they can't be under the influence of alcohol or pain or someone else. And the third is that they need to be a sound state of mind. So we don't allow minors, for example, to give informed consent. We don't allow individuals that are unwell in certain dimensions to give informed consent. And you need to actually meet these three criteria to then be able to give the consent for the medical practitioner to undertake the procedure. But if we think about the world of information and particularly public health, it's a very different paradigm. And it brings up the root of much of the misinformation and the so-called infodemic that we in the public health world are struggling with. For me, it really comes down to some basic misunderstandings about the drivers and root determinants of health and disease. And if you have to encapsulate that in a single word, it's the difference between option and choice. Now, to most of us, these sound pretty much like the same word, interchangeable, but actually they mean very different things. Choice is something that most people feel individuals make about their health. That we all have equal say and that we all have equal control over the outcomes of health and well-being. Option is the things that are afforded to us, the opportunities and determinants around us that drive our health and our well-being. And it's actually a misunderstanding of these two words that is the root of much of the global infodemic. Because we know that different communities, different demographics have unequal vulnerability to manipulative, exploitative, and straight out untruthful messaging. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that now. We know that young people are subject to, every day as they go through their lives, they're being bombarded, whether it's on screens, on bus shelters, on even in many countries, their school books and the footballs they use, whether it's on their football superstars on the telly, or whether it's on the game that they've downloaded. They're being bombarded with health messages of all different kinds. And if we go back to the concept of informed consent, do these meet the requirements that we would hold as a framework for other determinants of health? So kids on a bus, for example, being exposed as they get on and off the bus, going to school every day with information about, basically junk food. Is there full disclosure of the good and the bad side? Well, no. Very often, Coca-Cola is bringing us summer, and Cadbury's is bringing us happiness or Joyville. Now, I would argue they're a fairly one-sided dimension of the disclosure of the benefits, but with very little concern for the risks, that come with consuming some of these products. Are you free from coercion? Well, again, if you have your favourite superstar or a very healthy-looking young person holding a product that we know is associated with overweight, obesity, and chronic disease, again, it gets into the territory of coercion, particularly for young children. And thirdly, does it pass the sound state of mind test? Well, absolutely not. Primarily, this cookies and cream ad is here because they know that children use this bus to get to and from school every day. And unlike other forms of informed consent that we wouldn't allow a child to be directly marketed or communicated to like this, because they don't have the same sound state of mind to be able to make informed decisions as an adult, again, it doesn't pass the pub test. Another one that we see on our every day on our sporting events, again, sending this misinformation that somehow it's not cricket without a major American fast food fast food outlet. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm pretty sure cricket existed well before Macca's, and that the two have absolutely nothing to do with each other. But again, there's this misinformation that doesn't stand up to the informed consent that we hold so dear in other aspects of health. And thirdly, a study that we actually undertook found that half of 11 to 16-year-olds recalled seeing gambling advertising on social media. Again, we know, as Julie's just been through, this is not an accident. This is a highly sophisticated digital ecosystem where targeted messages are based around specific demographics that are collected, information on where the child goes, who their friends are, what they talk about online, what their preferences are, what they buy across multiple platforms. All of that information, up to 13 million data points by the time the child is a teenager, has been collected on the average Australian child and is used to then create highly specific, hyper-specific digital advertising that reaches that child at exactly the right time, in exactly the right place, in exactly the right mood, and when possibly even they're looking to make financial decisions or have some extra pocket money. This is all the new age of advertising. We also know that there's a strong social gradient to these issues, and this is another misconception. We know that the financial impact of COVID-19, for example, took a strong social gradient. Those already facing greatest barriers, economic, social, health, faced the greatest indirect impacts of coronavirus. It was through third factors like insecure housing, insecure employment, obesity. We see again strong social gradient between obesity and particularly among young people. And we see a strong social gradient even between some of the drivers. So there are up to 2.5 times as many junk food outlets in poorer neighbourhoods across Melbourne, Sydney, and Brisbane as there are in wealthier neighbourhoods. Again, this is no coincidence. This is all done in a way that obviously maximises profit, as Julie said, maximises profit and consumption in particularly the already marginalised communities. So I think what's really important as we try and kind of wade through, and particularly as policymakers, as we wade through the infodemic of misinformation. I formerly worked with the United Nations, and very often, you know, I would find world leaders, members of federal parliament, were also becoming more and more swayed by the infodemic of misinformation. And so a really important starting point is to understand that health is not an outcome of individual choice, but health is actually the outcome of deep drivers of the social, economic, financial, cultural, and commercial environments and drivers that we live in and learn, you know, are born, grow, learn, work, and die around. And again, Julie has talked about this. But then the question comes up of how do you regulate some of these issues? How do you regulate the issue of misinformation? But without putting the onus back on the individual and saying that it's about poor choice when we know that in fact it's not. You have to look at the upstream determinants. We need to be looking at some of the deeper drivers to ensure that the regulatory measures we use are in fact progressive in nature and benefit those who need it most. So I want to go through just quickly some examples from the child obesity world, because there's a huge amount of misinformation, but how do you regulate, how do you use regulatory tools to make sure that evidence-based messaging is reaching children who need it, particularly in lower income or more marginalised communities? Now, the levers many would turn to would be a social marketing campaign, more education. Well, actually, these are not the measures that help or support low income or more marginalised at-risk communities based on the global evidence. And so the types of policies that we're talking about to really regulate those environmental, social, cultural, political and commercial levers that lead to outcomes like obesity are things like school education and lunch programs, where children spend most of their time and where young people can be reached. So making sure that the environments in which children learn are free from advertising of unhealthy foods, that the environments around the schools are, again, the bus shelters, the walk to and from school, the immediate zones around the schools are free, again, from advertising of unhealthy foods. That schools themselves aren't running programs where conflicting information is being given to children by running a sporting program that's actually has branding of a junk food company, or even worse, gambling or alcohol in many countries around the world. Thinking about pricing policies. So at the end of the day, if there is a huge amount of misinformation in the nutrition space, for example, which there is, you know, what actually influences individuals is a combination of information through ensuring that the way that information is delivered is regulated, as was previously covered by Julie. But then it's also about using choice architecture and nudging policy, you know, nudging-based behavioural economic-based policies within the environment that actually reinforce the right information. You can't just give people information and then send them off into a world that gives them constantly conflicting information based on economic imperatives rather than health priorities. And so it's about removing junk food advertising and promotion so that there's not that conflicting information on every corner as a child walks to school. It's about increasing the prices of unhealthy foods so that their can of soft drink isn't cheaper than a bottle of water. It's about making sure that information on the front of labels in the supermarket, that you don't need to turn the label over and have a PhD in nutrition to understand and decipher whether one thing is healthy or whether another option is healthy, but that you're actually able to, that it's universal, clear, easy to read and interpret. And then also using other assets of government to incentivise and decrease the price of healthier foods. We've talked a little bit about online, so I'll skip over that because I think Julie covered that well, but there are some very good examples from around the world where they have managed to really successfully regulate misinformation for young people, whether it's codes in the UK or whether it's more restrictions or banning certain types of advertising. But how do you do this in a way that actually does engage and is owned then by the community? Because at the end of the day, if you're a policy maker, it's very easy to look at a community and say, oh, there's a lot of misinformation. the answer is just to tell them all what to do. And this is absolutely not the case. Most communities know what they want to achieve, but they don't have the tools, the support and the means to be able to do it. And so really our roles as regulators, our roles as policymakers and those that inform it should be to ensure that equitable regulation around misinformation reflects the values and needs of communities and is developed with them. So this involves investing time. This involves really understanding community priorities, experiences and insights, because there may be reasons for misinformation spreading that we're not aware of. This certainly was the case across COVID, and I know Luke covered a lot of this earlier, but also identifying barriers. Opposition is an important one, and then looking for unintended consequences, which will often occur with regulatory interventions. If we look at some effective examples, I think across coronavirus, there have been some really effective examples of highly tailored, equitable, equity-driven and co-created, or actually not even co-created, but community-owned and led information around coronavirus that did cut through. I think there are many good examples in the First Nations community space. Nacho did some fantastic, really targeted messaging that was informed and reflective of local cultures across Australia. It was owned and developed by Nacho and really used the language and the cultural preferences and priorities of communities that they were working with. And the other is around young people and you know, again, the huge amount of misinformation that I've talked about, whether it's across COVID and the responses, whether it's across more broad health and wellbeing determinants and the environments in which children are spending time. The digital native generation, you know, they are at the forefront of this warfare of misinformation. And you know, I think really making sure, again, when we develop policies as policymakers, that we're thinking about how do we engage young people to make sure that it speaks truly and respectfully to young people, that we're not assuming, you know, what measures or communication methods will work, what barriers exist, what unintended consequences might emerge, that we make the experience valuable to young people being involved and participating with us, that we work with partners who understand young people in this case, and that, of course, you know, we really take a lived experience approach. So, you know, the concept of expert itself is at the core of this global infodemic, the questioning of expert, and this comes off, you know, decades of, I think, an inherent disconnect between science and the wider population. And as a scientist, I think I can say a certain degree of arrogance as well at times from the scientific community, maybe most likely unintended. But what we really need to do is understand that while there is technical experience, scientific experience, equally important is lived experience, is the actual understanding of the everyday lived environment, what is impacting on people's health. And the marrying of those two, I think, is going to be critical to overcoming this enormous global scourge of misinformation that we now face as a public health community. Thanks, Simon, and back to you.
Thank you, Sandro. Luke and Julie, that's been three really interesting presentations. Now I'm going to ask a couple of questions of the panel before we open up to the Slido questions. Julie, I'll jump to you first if you don't mind. The first one, keen to understand what you think is the most important lesson our audience could take away from today's discussion. I was intrigued by your discussion of the 4 Rs and then the responsibility of the platforms, but there's also the people who are called the unreasonable people who are on these platforms. Keen to what any takeaways you'd have as to how you deal with those sort of unreasonable people.
Yeah, I mean, we just had an irate person come into our office last week, believing they were charged with electromagnetic field. So you know, I've had bloody packages sent to me. So yeah, we're dealing with a lot of people on the fringe, and even one of the first questions we ask on any of our reporting cues around people who are experiencing image-based abuse or cyberbullying is what is, on a scale of 1 to 10, what is your mental state? Because we need to triage those where people are highly distressed, and these are highly distressing things that happen to people. And I think we know that online harms can be significant, real, and enduring, even if there aren't visible scars or bruising. But we know that dealing with people every day. I actually I'm slightly fearful about getting new powers around adult cyber abuse. Because there's a lot less reason attached to that. So with youth-based cyberbullying, we often see that is peer-to-peer. It's an extension of conflict that's happening within the schoolyard. So we can identify the origins of the conflict. Once we expeditiously get the content taken down, then we tend to work with the parents, the school community to get to the heart of the conflict. And then we find that both the online and the face-to-face conflict dissipates. Where adults are concerned is it's much more random, and there are a range of intersectional factors that determine whether or not you're more likely to be a target of hate speech or other forms of abuse. So if you're women, particularly a woman in a journalist, a politician, a feminist, you're in sporting or entertainment. If you are Indigenous and Torres Strait Islander, you're 3 times more likely to be targeted online, or if you're a Muslim Australian or have different sectional cultural factors. If you identify as LGBTQI+, you're also, or you're living with a disability, you're also more likely to be targeted, and by a stranger. So there's a lot of unreason, and some of these adult cases that we get into our office are actually have been disputes that have been going on for 2 or 3 years. Nobody is pristine on either side of the discussion. We sometimes have people reporting the same target of abuse, and we're just seeing this funneling of long-term grievances that in some way that's playing out online that we're expected to kind of mediate, which isn't really our job, but we kind of have to take some of that on when we're engaging with people in distress. So this is a really important question, because what we're talking about is human behavior playing out in an online space. And there isn't always rationality there. So we can't really blame technology. I do think the technology platforms and those who run them have responsibility for making sure that they're assessing the risks and the harms, and they're building the protections in at the front end. And I did touch upon safety by design. But in terms of the way that I've set up the office that I think makes it somewhat unique is that we look across the 3 domains. Prevention, because we don't want the harms happening in the first place, but we know that behavioral change takes a long time. And I want to echo some of Sandra's points around the importance of engaging communities, particularly more vulnerable communities, in the co-design process, particularly for young people. Actually, right now, we're having a youth roundtable simultaneously going back and forth between the 2. Because if you're not sending out authentic messages or using media like video or YouTube like they do, you're not going to reach kids in the same way. They can smell a lack of authenticity. So prevention, the protection that we provide to our citizens is in taking down the harmful content, and we've done that in as quickly as a half hour, sometimes 2 days, sometimes longer. Sometimes we get image-based abuse reports that have up to 400 URLs, and they're all overseas hosted content. And we will go through every URL and issue notices to every site that we need to get the content taken down. But the proactive change piece is really important. So assessing the emerging threats, how technology can be harnessed for good, but also can be weaponized for bad, so that we can anticipate these harms. And then again, get the companies taking responsibility for minimizing the threat surface on their own platforms is really important. So that was a very long-winded answer, but a very loaded question.
Oh, sorry, Julie. Perhaps I'll hand over to you, Luke. What do you think is the most important lesson or takeaway we should take from this discussion today?
I might focus my comments on voluntary compliance as being a key pathway to effective regulation. First and foremost, what characterises a good law is a law that achieves not only a sound, good public intent, but also it's a law which by its nature the community will voluntarily comply with. It's a law that makes sense to the community. It's a law which the community understands and which the community subscribes to in terms of its intent. And over the course of the COVID disaster here in Victoria particularly, ensuring and being actively engaged in the policy debate about how the CHO directions were shaped, absolutely informed and led by the health advice, that's been a key part of our role because one of the key pieces of advice we've provided over the course of the journey is our view about the practicalities around enforcement, but also particularly around voluntary compliance. And an example of that is the mask wearing debate. So we were seeing a significant drop off towards the end of mandatory mask wearing with voluntary compliance, particularly in warmer weather, and a very particular risk where you have a mandatory requirement which is no longer being voluntarily subscribed to the community. It does open up a situation where the law gets held up to ridicule. There's a delicate balance to be struck there. And so towards the tail end of the mandatory mask wearing piece in public, particularly at beaches, we were certainly flagging. Frontline police, assistant commissioners were flagging in the policy debate the concern that we ran the risk of losing the community unless we took the opportunity to, based on health advice, to reset. And the key piece about regulation is it needs to be adaptive, it needs to be fit for purpose, and ultimately it needs to be owned by the community. The second observation that I would make is this, and this again goes to voluntary compliance. The community want to see that people who aren't playing by the rules are held to account. And it's within that context that enforcement is important. But there's also a significant degree of theatre. We call it the theatre of policing. So visible presence, things like the so-called rings of steel, vehicle checkpoints. Now, I mean, if you wanted to get around a vehicle checkpoint and avoid being stopped, of course you could. But the theatre of policing played a critical role in giving the community a sense of confidence that police were out and about protecting the community and that wrongdoers would be identified and held to account. And that was certainly reflected in the visible evidence of our enforcement. But the other piece about enforcement is it has to be reasonable, has to be fair, has to be balanced. And so while we've issued upwards of 40,000 fines, that doesn't reflect the totality of our enforcement effort, because in terms of our total enforcement effort, about 25% of interactions with people who weren't playing by the rules occasioned warnings, occasioned advice, occasioned encouragement to do the right thing by the community. And then the final point I'd make, and it's a communications piece, is you do need to activate the base. You can't just rely on good law. You can't just rely on a voluntary compliance. You also need to activate the base and provide language and words to the community that allows the community to call unreasonable and unlawful behaviour out. And if you want an example of that, I guess you could go to the press conference that I was involved in early September, where I made references to the tinfoil hat wearing brigade and batshit crazy nonsense, to cite a couple of examples. Now, I was not seeking to persuade anyone. What I was seeking to do was to arm the community with the language and with the characterisation that would allow the community to call behaviour for what it was and give some encouragement to the vast law-abiding members of our community that we had their back and we were standing for science, we were standing for reason, and we were standing for public health and safety. And so our approach to comms was very much about supporting, nudging, but also empowering the community around doing the right thing and staying safe in the face of what is a deadly pandemic.
Thank you very much, Luke. Finally, Sandro, did you want to add anything about the role of communications in sort of arming the community to be able to distinguish unreason?
I just had a few kind of golden rules that we use when we're communicating, you know, main health messages, and then we can quickly touch on, you know, how you arm then the community. You know, first of all, we spend a lot of time, I think, trying to bust myths. So one of the golden rules is don't talk about the myth, don't bring attention to what's not true, just focus on what is, and keep the message clear and consistent. I think the genius of one of the many geniuses of Luke is that his language is highly relatable. It's not jargon filled, and I think people feel very confident and comfortable when they hear leaders of authority speaking in a way that they can relate to. It's very, very important, and that's been a major source of pain, I think, for the scientific community and the medical community that I come from. I think repetition, it feels like Groundhog Day at times for those of us, you know, trying to communicate key health messages, but it really is about repetition, 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 and keeping the communication consistent. Also about, and Luke just touched on this, understanding there will always be a loud minority. And in fact, if you're in the public health space, if we do something to try and counter the messaging coming out of tobacco companies, and we don't get what we call the squeal test, if we don't get some strong pushback from the tobacco industry, we have to rethink our tactics, because we know that we're doing something effective if certain individuals in the community who will never agree with what we say and never even listen to the messages are not pushing back. So understanding there will always be a loud minority, not letting that sway you. I think really importantly, again, and this came true across the coronavirus pandemic, acknowledging uncertainty. You know, if you don't acknowledge uncertainty, that science is not perfect, and that we're 8 months or 10 months in to a pandemic for a virus we didn't even know existed 12 months ago. Of course, there are still going to be unknowns, acknowledging that the science is not perfect, but there is a lot that we do know, and certainly enough to act so that you don't leave yourself open to that criticism. And finally, as I said, just handing over, you know, the reins. So if you want to reach young people, not just engage young people or get their views or you know, do a questionnaire, but actually employ young people, bring them into the organisation, give them a role. You know, some of the best results we saw across the coronavirus response was when local, culturally and linguistically diverse local leaders across Victoria were really engaged and brought in to the team. And I think that's when we saw some of the strongest and most effective results in terms of communicating effectively, appropriately across the pandemic. In terms of then, you know, protecting particularly, you know, populations, you know, it does again come back to ensuring that young people have the right education. There are countries around the world that teach much more effectively things like deductive reasoning skills and actually include, you know, digital hygiene in the formal education system from a very early age. We know that children at 6 months of age start to understand and link and recite preferences due to the influence of advertising. So from 6 months of age, kids are already being influenced by advertising. So you need to get in early and build those digital hygiene types skills that Julie talked about. But it's also about regulating the environment. And some of the stuff, you know, when we're talking about children going out into an environment or having a phone in their pocket that for which they have collected, as I said, 13 million data points by the time they're a teenager, and know every single aspect of who they are, what they believe in, what they stand for, and what drives them and what gets them upset, which is ultimately what keeps them engaged on Twitter and Instagram. And so it's as much creating that outrage to keep their eyeballs on the platform, to be able to then harvest that attention to the highest bidder, in the form of advertising. That is the business model, and that is only going to change if we regulate the environment appropriately, as other countries have done around the world, and as we need to do here. And I think it needs to start with young people, because again, it comes back to that informed consent. Young people are not, we don't allow them to vote, we don't allow them to drive, we don't allow them to buy alcohol. We shouldn't allow them to be exposed to endless misinformation that ultimately comes at the cost of their health.
Thank you, Sandro. The most popular question on Slido, and I'm wrestling with which of the panelists feels best able to answer it. It's the question about a key principle of reason is to provide a balanced view, including dissenting voices. But how do we avoid giving a platform to people who are simply wrong? Julie, I wonder, would you be able to have some views? I know in your past history you've worked for firms such as Twitter and Microsoft, who have to wrestle with that question about giving a balanced, allow dissenting voices, but excluding stuff that's wrong. Do you have any sort of insights into the challenge there?
Well, I'm wrong all the time. hope that helps. Listen, it's a very fraught area. As you indicated, I spent 17 years at Microsoft and then a couple of years at Twitter right before the eSafety office was established. And I joined both firms with a great sense of optimism about where technology could take us. And a lot of that promise has been realized. If you think about where would we have been during this pandemic, particularly under lockdown, had we not had that connectivity? It has reduced isolation and allowed us to continue to work and learn and connect. I see my job as being someone who tries to harness and promote the benefits of technology whilst minimizing the risks. Now, many times when I joined Twitter, for instance, the whole idea was speaking truth to power, being a great democratic leveler. Free speech and the First Amendment very much fueled Twitter. And but as I went along and I saw the daily abuse that happened on Twitter, the targeted abuse, particularly towards women and those from other vulnerable communities. And I got engaged in trying to help these people every day when they couldn't, because there's this inherent power balance between the behemoths and the users. So even if you report things, they don't necessarily get taken down. And there's quite a bit of opacity still, even as companies claim to be more transparent through transparency reports. But I would argue that they are selectively transparent rather than radically transparent. There was no recourse. If you tweet something that's very offensive or very hurtful to you and it isn't taken down, they say, sorry, it doesn't violate our rules. Where does that leave you? And that's precisely why the eSafety office was set up, to serve as a safety net so that we could advocate on behalf of our citizens, particularly our most vulnerable, our children. Now, where it is going to get a little bit sticky is if we get these adult powers, and the companies don't want to be the arbiters of the cultural wars, and neither do we. But I guess I would just say, having watched how so many of these policies are applied, both being in the inside and then watching as a regulator when we've called for takedown of certain content, it's always going to be subjective. There is no such thing as total objectivity. And that's challenging. And what we saw happening, the kind of untold story about the surge in reports over the pandemic, there were lots of simplistic explanations given: more people on malign, more predators targeting them, more people lashing out. Yes, that's true. But what was happening in the background is that the content moderation workforce, the shadow workforce that most of the social media sites have from developing countries, couldn't couldn't work. They couldn't go into their place of work, and for occupational health and safety reasons, you can't be looking at terrorist content and child sexual abuse content from home, particularly when you've got kids running around. So basically, the platform started to lose control and couldn't manage the amount of abuse that they were getting. So the reporting queues were porous already. So tons of stuff. So we saw a 650% increase in CSAM, child sexual abuse material, on the open web, on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook and the like. And when we approached them and said, what's happening here? They pretty much validated that was what was happening. So they've shifted their messaging to we're using artificial intelligence, AI, to detect and ultimately remove this content. But we know that AI is not balanced. In many cases, it's biased. It needs to be tested and expanded. And most companies use human moderation in conjunction with AI. So it's a really tough question, and it's tough to be the arbiters. But I believe if you build the roads and the vehicles, you need to be erecting the guardrails, and you also need to be policing these roads for other dangerous drivers, so that the rest of us don't end up becoming the online casualties. That's the business they entered. They need to take some responsibility and again use all of those resources, the intellectual capability, the advanced technology, the money that they're printing on a daily basis. We just need to see more corporate will and greater prioritization on tackling these issues. As Sandro said, they can target a child, they can target any of us for advertising purposes with a lot of precision. I don't know why they can't do the same when it comes to promoting and protecting the safety of their users.
Thank you, Julie. Yeah, a very vexed challenge, I think, and we need to work it through to make sure we continue to get the benefits of these networks. We wouldn't be having this webinar today if it wasn't for one Microsoft product on Teams, but we need to manage the risks as well. Luke, I wonder if I could hand over a question to you. There's a question here: how can we as regulators avoid a situation where unconscious bias in our approach allows unreasonable behaviour in some groups and not in others? And I think this was an issue at the start of the pandemic where there were different protests going on and there was arguments about the challenge, and also I presume in the day-to-day work of your officers, how do you minimise the potential for unconscious bias?
Yeah, good question, Sandro. Every fortnight I have the opportunity to catch up with our probationary constables who are coming on rotation, and one of the things I speak about is discretion, and I highlight the need for us to take ourselves, that is our unconscious biases and ourselves, out of decision making. The best way to do that is, of course, is to name those so that we become conscious about them, and then ensure that when we're exercising discretion, we're doing that in the interests of public safety, in the interests of the mission of Victoria Police, which is fundamentally to uphold the law and protect people's rights. And you can only do that if you name your own biases and, as I say, take yourself out of your decision making. The other point that I would make is, well, how was that applied within the context of policing protest over the course of the COVID emergency over the past 9 months? And I'd go back to one of the remarks I made in my presentation, which was police are blind to the issues that are being protested about. We're not in the business of picking winners. It's our job to support people in expressing their right to protest, their right to freedom of assembly, but to do that in a safe way and in a way which doesn't compromise other people's rights. In this context, the right to life, the right to property, and a range of other rights which clearly were going to be engaged and adversely affected by the conduct of public protest. So that's the position that we adopted. The other observation I'd make is that the context within which protest occurred from May through to last weekend has changed significantly over the course of that period, and as a result, our force posture, our approach, our policing intent has necessarily changed as well, which is why, for example, in relation to the Black Lives Matter protest, you saw us taking a very different approach to the approach that we took with the protests, particularly over the course of September. Back in Black Lives, leaving home to protest was not unlawful. Yes, there were restrictions on public gatherings, but we understood from the organisers that they were going to be compliant. On the day they weren't, so we issued fines to the protest organisers. The other piece was, at that point, we'd only had a relatively small number of deaths and pretty much very limited levels of community transmission. And so the risk settings, the public health risk settings we were operating against, were fundamentally different to what we saw in August and in September. I mean, you know, May into June, we were seeing weekly infection rates in the thousands. We were seeing deaths reaching the 800 mark in the community. And there was, those sorts of numbers absolutely focused our mind in terms of our approach and in terms of the need for the community to clearly understand our expectation, which was don't leave home and engage in a potentially mass spreading event, because you're going to kill your grandparents, you're going to kill your loved ones, you're going to kill others in the community. And our approach over the course of September was very much about preventing protest. And it meant that instead of seeing 10,000 people on the streets in September in individual protests, we're able to keep it down to 150, 200. And we're also able to identify all of the participants in the protest, not only so that we could hold them to account, but also so that if it was a spreading event, we would be in a position to provide those details to the health authorities so that they could undertake contact tracing. They were the sorts of issues that we were weighing up as we worked our way through this. But the key piece for us was we don't buy into whether or not we agree with what's been protested about. For us, our focus is on community safety and on protecting people's rights. And that's been our focus from before the COVID disaster and all the way through it.
I think you've actually answered another question we had, which is how can the broader community be mobilised to change the behaviour of unreasonable members of society, with your example of your effective process of reducing the number of participants in some of these protests. But I wondered, Sandro, if you had any thoughts on the challenge of getting the broader community mobilised to change the behaviour of unreasonable members in society. Thinking about the anti-vaxxers, for example, that is obviously going to be a potential issue for us in the coming months.
Yeah, well, I think, Simon, it comes back to those same points. It really comes, you know, it is the it's the responsibility of individuals in leadership roles, but it really is an opportunity, I think, and something that we, as a community, we would encourage community members where possible to challenge, to have robust conversations. There is a lot of misinformation out there, and there'll be individuals in our families, in our friendship circles that have a different perspective from our own. Having those conversations and trying to understand the point at which they come from, but also being armed with the facts and being able to maybe talk through and also those individuals realising that there is a broad community that shares a different understanding. It is important. It's a different type of herd immunity, but if we have a collective number of individuals, if most people in the community think and agree and support the actions of government, which they do based on polling, then it is important that we're open and we talk about those in the same way that the noisy minority often seems much larger than it is, because they're talking about those other values or opinions more loudly. So I think there are things that individuals can do, but really, again, I think Julie summed it up well, that the business model for social media and even media more broadly. This is not a social media issue. This is not a a Gen Y or a Gen Z issue. Shock jocks have been around for decades. We know that shock and conflict sells newspapers. It is part of the business model, and misinformation is even at some points, and certainly at the moment, an inherent and important part of a business model that is highly lucrative, and so it comes back to really looking at that business model and understanding in a way that doesn't impinge on free speech, but at the same time that those digital environments we now live in are held to the same types of standards that we would expect of traditional media, which they replace. But coming back to the previous question about uncertainty, I think it is also important, because very often in the scientific community, we're very good, I think we're becoming better, and government, I think, has been very good at acknowledging uncertainty. But I think we also need to do that in a way that's balanced. So, if you think back 10 years, climate change, the approach, very often was to have two people on a panel talking about climate change, one for and one against. Now, 99.99999% of the world's scientists acknowledge and agree that climate change is real. It is real, it is happening, there is no question. The tiny group left are largely funded by industries that don't have an interest in, regulatory levers that will, again, impact on a business model. So, we need to acknowledge that there are going to be, at the margins, small uncertainties, particularly as we move forward through the pandemic. There is so much that we know about the virus. We're not in February or March. There is so much that we know. There are small uncertainties still about the vaccine or new technologies that are coming online. Yes, we need to acknowledge those, but we also need to acknowledge that actually, there is an overwhelming amount of evidence that the global scientific community and policy community agree on, and that community needs to be unified and loud, and forthcoming, and use great spokespeople like and community leaders like Luke to make sure that the message is getting out in a way that resonates and is received appropriately. Not kind of giving equal airtime or other approaches, and I think that is a risk for policy and scientific community. There's a tendency to overestimate uncertainty or over communicate uncertainty, and then in opposing views, which Luke characterised very well before. I won't repeat these words, but there is a tendency to under communicate uncertainty, and so that again feeds into this perception in the public that scientists are unsure, but the conspiracy theorists are absolutely adamant. And so I think we need to be balanced. That 90% of the science is set, whether it's climate change and 99.9, nutrition science and it's 99, or the virus, which is maybe 90% of science is now understood and set. We're really now, tinkering at the margins, getting more and more specificity around what works and new technologies that are emerging. But the basics are pretty much agreed on worldwide, and we need to be very clear about that.
Thank you, Sandra. I think that's the last question we've got time for today. I'd like to thank our three panellists. Fantastic to get your insights, three diverse insights, but I think a strong focus on communication, on the importance of effective communication, which all three of you have showed in spades today.